Okay, good morning. So I'm Bob Griffin. I'm going to moderate this panel today. The focus is 21st century resiliency, microgrids within the DOD in California. The timing couldn't be better. 2017 was disastrous. Puerto Rico was a disaster. Texas, Florida, California with the mudslides. We live in a highly digitized world. It demands reliable grid capability. Providing high-quality power to our facilities like hospitals, data centers, military installations is critical. This panel will highlight technological breakthroughs, regional projects, and other initiatives to improve the resiliency of our grid. We've structured the panel. We're very fortunate to have these 5 panel members. We've got the first 2, Secretary McGinn and Admiral Lindsay, that are going to talk about what leadership requirements are necessary to facilitate change and what the requirements are within the Navy and DOD. Then we're fortunate to have Susan and Dan that are going to talk to us about technology and the fact that it's there. We don't need to wait for it. And then Chairman Weissmiller is going to kind of bring it home and talk about how he and the California Energy Commission can assist in the enabling of putting this technology in place on a real-time basis. So we'll start with Secretary McGinn, who I worked for 3 years, doing the 1 gigawatt initiative for the Navy. I could spend the rest of the time with the panel going over his resume, so I'll give you a brief summary. He's the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Environment, and Installations. He also was the president of ACOR before that. He spent a few years with the Navy, retiring at Vice Admiral, and he was a fighter pilot. He was a test pilot. His credentials are impeccable. Great to have him on this panel. Admiral Lindsay and I also work for Secretary McGinn, so it's a close family. Admiral Lindsay is now the commander of the Navy Region Southwest. He was the commandant of the Naval District Washington. Like Admiral McGinn, he's also a naval aviator. Spent a lot of time in deployments, both in Antarctica, which we talked about last night, and the Arabian Gulf. He served on both the Carl Vinson and the Abraham Lincoln, so very fortunate to have Yancey today. Susan Kennedy, founder and CEO of Advanced Microgrid Solutions, really at the cutting edge of innovation right now for microgrid solutions. Her company basically is the first company to implement strategic solutions after the closing of the San Onofre plant. Susan's got both federal and state experience. She worked for Government Schwarzenegger as Chief of Staff. She also was the Communications Director for Dianne Feinstein, so very fortunate to have Susan. Dan Coey, also part of our technical solution on this panel. He leads the design, implementation, and integration and construction of advanced energy storage solutions and distributed energy. Many of the projects he's going to talk about are in direct support of the DOD, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. They're very interesting, and I want to leave a lot of time for him to talk about it. And finally, Chairman Weissmiller, who obviously is an inspiration to us all, and I put him at the end of this because he's really the integrator. You've got the need, you've got the great ideas, but someone's got to find a way to get the rate structure to work, the financial incentives to work, get the governor on board. So we really appreciate what Bob brings to the table. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Denny for some brief remarks, work this way, and then I'm going to hit him with some questions at the end. So go ahead, Denny.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here. Good morning, everybody. Back in February of 2016, well before the November election, we had a meeting that we wanted to discuss the work that Bob and his team on the Navy's, or the Department of the Navy and Marine Corps, Renewable Energy Program Office, or REPO as we fondly called it, was doing. We had made great strides putting out large projects as big as 150 megawatts. But we thought, okay, let's do a REPO 2.0, try to define where we've been, where we are now, and where we're headed with it. One of the things that came out of that review in about June of 2016, about 5 months before the election. That will become relevant very quickly here. We decided that, okay, yes, we're using renewable energy, but why are we doing it? What's the business case, if you will, for the military mission of the Navy and Marine Corps for doing this? And it was energy security and resilience, because to the extent that you can diversify and disperse, if you will, your energy resources, you are more secure in your mission, meeting your energy needs for your mission, and you're more resilient. And briefly, resilience, there's all kinds of different definitions, but effectively, the best one I like is, there's an old Timex watch commercial that said, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. And that is what resilience is all about. It's the ability of a system, in this case an energy system, to absorb some sort of disturbance and to recover quickly so that you get back to 100% functionality as soon as possible. In some cases, that's measured in hours. In many cases, it's measured in weeks or months. Puerto Rico comes to mind as an example of what not to do in terms of having energy resiliency. So we decided that we were going to rename REPO, and it became the Resilient Energy Program Office. We try to claim great prescience in making that understanding that we didn't think Donald Trump was going to be elected president in November of 2016. But we felt that the business case, the military mission business case, really was the underlying rationale for us doing all things with renewables, with microgrids, which the other panelists are far more qualified than me to talk about. And so we continue to have the Department of the Navy's Resilient Energy Program Office, because it just underwrites the critical mission for all of our installations, Navy and Marine Corps installations. That basically, these installations, airfields, ports, training areas, simply are the launching pads for us as a nation sending military power downrange around the world, no matter where it's required, to do the nation's bidding and to preserve our national security and our interests all around the world. So resilience and the Department of Defense, and I've been talking Department of Navy, but it's true for Army and Air Force as well, is all about being able to sustain mission energy security and to do it in a variety of ways with things like renewable energy, storage, and microgrids. With that, I'll pass it along to Admiral Lindsay, who continues to make this happen.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning. You know, for the last 10 plus years, the Navy has been focused on energy and water projects and conservation. And since 2007, the point today is compared to 2007, we're using about 1.5 billion gallons less per year than we were 10 years ago. And our energy density, that's the energy usage per square foot in our facilities, has been reduced by 30% since 2003. So we're making headway on those, and we're continuing to work to reduce our water and our energy usage. Now that makes sense for various reasons. Folks think, well, it's because you want to be more green. No, not necessarily, but that is a benefit. It's because, as the Secretary said, it makes economic sense. It makes sense from a security and resiliency standpoint, and it makes sense from a warfighting perspective. You don't want all your eggs in one basket, and so diversifying our energy sources, making them more resilient and more secure makes sense from a warfighting perspective. And yes, there is environmental benefit, and it's the right thing to do, and it reduces the military's impact on the environment and the effects we have on it. Now, some examples. The Secretary mentioned the 150 megawatt. That was the WAPA deal. That was completed in August 2016. That will provide 1/3 of the energy needs for 14 Southern California Navy and Marine Corps bases. 200 electric vehicles. If you're in the last panel here, Commissioner Hochschild mentioned that we just fielded over 200 electric vehicles in bases in Southern California, to include charging infrastructure as well. And we're hoping that we can continue to move in the direction of increasing the number of electrical vehicles in our non-tactical fleet. A non-tactical vehicle fleet is those vehicles that we use for administrative purposes, both on base and off. And then wind turbines. We have 3 aging wind turbines out on San Clemente Island, which is a Navy-owned island about 60 miles off the San Diego coast. And those need to be changed out. So we're looking at upgrading those. And once we do that and include a flywheel energy storage solution, which will help with our grid stability on the island, we expect to generate about 30% of the power needs of the island with these improved windmills, or wind turbines, I should say. And then we've recently installed 7 wind turbines on St. Nicholas Island, which is a Navy-owned island off the coast of Ventura County. And we expect those to provide up to 50% of the island's needs in the near future, especially when we get a storage solution out there, which looks to be probably a battery of some type. Now, we don't do this work in a vacuum. We have to have close collaborative and cooperative partnerships, not only with industry, who Susan and Dan represent here, but also with the California Energy Commission, CalI Independent System Operator, and other state and local municipalities, and the utilities. They're our partners. They have the good ideas. They can bring the solutions to us that will help us get after our challenges and our needs. A couple final comments. The tools that are most useful to us are the ones that bring third-party financing, so we don't have to pay for it up front. Energy savings performance contracts, power purchase agreements are some of the key tools we've been using over the last several years to get after our needs. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the cyber challenge. Not only going forward, and things need to be cyber secure that we put on our installations, but as we recapitalize and improve the existing infrastructure, cyber is a huge challenge and a very expensive challenge that we continue to chip away at. So with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Susan.
You know, from my perspective, I've been around in government long enough to sort of see the patterns in how these major investments in new technologies and infrastructure are come about, and I think what happens in the energy industry is major deployment of technologies tends to follow catalytic events. And if you look back at the oil embargo and the energy crisis of the 1970s and 1980s, was really the first wave of energy technology under the rubric of energy security and getting off of foreign oil. A lot of investment in cogeneration and first investments in solar really made back then. 9/11, after the attacks of 9/11, there was another big wave of emphasis on energy independence, and so a lot of investment in electrification of the transportation and the energy infrastructure. California, of course, had the energy crisis, which then spawned hundreds of pieces of legislation and billions of dollars in investment in distributed generation for resiliency purposes. And then the financial meltdown in 2007, the worldwide financial meltdown, resulted in billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, and energy infrastructure was a major, major part of that. So you had smart grid technologies, advanced metering, renewable generation, electric vehicles. Today, as a result of all of these waves, you now have mass deployment of distributed energy resources. Solar is now the lowest cost resource in many markets around the world. Mass deployment of electric vehicles and penetration of electric vehicles is actually a topic of hot conversation on how to manage those in various distribution level planning processes. Then you have the recent disasters in Puerto Rico and Texas and Houston, Florida, and in California with the wildfires. So we are seeing another wave of investment back towards resiliency to be able to withstand these. And you've got all these distributed technologies that are now commercially viable. So what we're seeing now is the next wave is going to really be dominated by microgrid technology and the control technology that harnesses the distributed resources and builds that resiliency at the local level and then up into the distribution level. And so I think that we're beginning what is now the era of the microgrid, in my view, because it's a direct result of the what's come in the past and the disasters that just took place.
Dan?
So PDE Total Energy Solutions, we come from the private side as well. We're a design build engineering firm working on military microgrids since 2012 continuously. And I'm going to take you through 3 or 4 projects that we're doing or have completed in the state of California to give you an idea of what is actually being installed right now. But it's no surprise that military microgrids are very, very robust right now and a lot of attention and investment in them. There's, 570,000 DOD buildings. There are 400 military bases throughout the country, a $4.1 billion annual energy expense for the military. So you can see why the integration of renewables and to build resiliency and lower operating costs is a prime objective of the DOD. In 2012, we worked on a project at the Marine Corps Air-Ground Combat Base in 29 Palms. It's the largest military Type 2B microgrid. It's a 10 megawatt microgrid that can operate independent of the grid and grid connected, but the caveat here is when it is islanded or disconnected from the grid, it will allow the renewables to stay online. And that's accomplished by pairing a battery to levelize the PV productions to minimize the ramp rates of the cogen plant. That project is a PPA with Johnson Controls. We were add-on to that project. That project saves the base $6 million annually for that project, with another $1.1 million with the addition of solar coming online. The second project I'm going to talk about was a forward operating base microgrid at Port Hueneme, which had some CEC funding, which was coupling 57 kilowatts of solar on flat racks, which are deployable. Everything was quick disconnect, so the whole project could be disassembled, shipped off site wherever it needed to go, and just plug and play and put back together. It also coupled 3 flow battery technology, which were fully containerized and programmed and ready to go, along with a diesel generator in that case. So that whole project was completed and could be deployed as required. The third project we're working on right now is we're commissioning it this week, as a matter of fact, is at Port Hueneme. It's for XWIX and it's building the Navy's microgrid testbed. And it's very, very apparent that the Navy and the DOD is not satisfied with claiming that products work and that control systems can integrate with the multiple different manufacturers. They want it proved. And so as part of what we're doing is we're building built the electrical infrastructure to proof of concept of different technologies. So that's a very complicated AC coupled microgrid that has got a lot of attention along with an advanced control system. We've also just recently completed the largest net zero energy facility, not for DOD, but it combines renewables, load management in the city of Commerce, and battery energy storage, optimizing all the different technologies for a fully integrated net zero plus building. And in 2014, we completed, that we're aware of, the largest completely off-grid power desalination plant in the Caribbean in Anguilla. It produces between 250 and 400,000 gallons of water a day off solar and lithium-ion batteries only. It's the utility, when they came to inspect it, called it voodoo. They couldn't believe it worked. But it's really amazing to see 450 horsepower, 800 PSI reverse osmosis pumps and the screaming noise, and then walk outside and you hear birds and see solar panels. So it was quite an accomplishment for a company. So a lot of exciting things happening right now.
Thank you very much. Bob?
Yeah, I think it's useful to talk a little bit about where we've been, what we're doing now, and where we're going. And in terms of, in many respects, I think the way the microgrids in the military started was back under Danny's predecessor, Jackie Pfannenstiel, and the Energy Commission had funded a microgrid at one of the universities in San Diego. UCSD. And in fact, the Admiral and I visited there at that stage, and he came back saying, I want one of these. And so it was clearly something which helps on the resilient side. Yeah, and so I think we've had a great partnership with the military, combination of personalities and interest, But I mean, the reality is, as you develop innovative technologies, you have to find someone who's willing to try them. And they're not all going to work, but I mean, that's been one of the beauties of our relationship. Obviously, the colleges are very interested in trying things too, but somehow you have to move it from an academic situation to a real-world, boots-on-the-ground culture. And so that certainly the Navy Marines have been there to provide that reality check on these devices. And probably about a year ago, I mean, when we were talking at one of our confabs, we were both, Danny and I were both saying, God, if you ask 10 engineers what's a microgrid, you're going to get 15 definitions. And the only way you're going to be able to make progress if you can standardize. Obviously, this is still a time of experimentation, but you really have to figure out what works and how to get there. And so at this stage, the Energy Commission is doing a couple of things to push things forward. One of them is we're funding demonstrations, and we can talk about that more later. But again, just continue this push to try different things, try to get some standardization, see what works. And we're also working with the various agencies to come up with a roadmap. How's California going to move forward in this area? And that's particularly important that this is an area where the Energy Commission, the PUC, and the Cal ISO all have to work together. And you have to figure out what the problems are. And I've always said one of it is we need some degree of standardization. We need to figure out the value proposition going forward and how to keep driving costs down to really move this along. And in terms of thinking about it, you know, one of the things we've done at the Energy Commission is pulling together climate assessments. So right now we're in our fourth one. And the basic message has been our climate is changing. It's hotter, it's drier. That tends to lead to fires. And we've been working closely with Commissioner Randolph at the PUC on what to do in that context. And this year really has been like, we need to move in terms of adaptation into real time, moving forward, and we have to do it, in terms of resilience and how to get resilience in the utility grid. So that means microgrid's got to be front and center. And I think Bob will allow me one slide to get the conversation going.
Yes, sir.
So could you show me just the very last slide? And as he's getting to the last slide, for context, California used to have one really bad fire every decade. Okay? If you were to rank the top 20 worst fires in California history, 13 of them have been in the past decade. So bottom line, things are getting worse. If you were to rank among the top 3 worst, including the worst in terms of 41 deaths and billions of dollars of cost, 3 of them have been this year. So again, this is really getting pretty intense. And the last chart, basically the PUC and CAL FIRE have gotten together. And about 10 years ago, the PUC had concluded that about 35% of California is high fire risk. The current chart is 47%. That's where 10% of our people live. And it turns out if you're a utility and it's windy and hot like it is today, you're going to start looking at those high fire risk areas and starting to drop load. I think today there's about 2,600 customers in the San Diego system who don't have power. So now the next question is, obviously, if you look at those high fire risk areas, we've got some critical infrastructure there. And how the hell are we going to keep them operating in this situation? And we're just starting, right? I mean, this is, what's it going to be like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? So the question for this panel really is, okay, how do we identify the critical infrastructure in the higher fire risk areas, and how do we start putting microgrids on them now so that we can have a much more resilient system responding to the climate change driving fires?
Well, that makes sense, perfect sense, and it brought me back to thinking about when we were working with utility companies to host new power generation. And Denny and I were making the case from an energy security standpoint that military installations are probably one of the best suited places because we're going to protect it for you for free. It's fenced, it's basically a buffer or barrier zone. So, and it's already cleared in many cases because of air operations. so you don't have the fire threat as much. I'm going to turn the tone a little bit. I might regret doing this, but I'm going to ask Secretary McGinn whether or not he's concerned that the new administration seems to be less committed to clean energy and resiliency, at least on its surface. And that could be an incorrect observation, but Denny, your thoughts?
I think there are two stories going on. One, at the political rhetoric level, it seems to be well, as Jonathan Weisgill said this morning, a return to the 1950s, the good old days of coal and, when America was great back then, I guess. So at the working level, and Admiral Lindsay is really a good example of this, because we have a mission to do in the United States military, the beat continues. Where there's a strong business case, where the benefits are measured in military mission resilience, military mission security, those projects are going to go forward. There may not be as much public affairs aspects to it, but I think it's really, really going forward. If you raise it above the Department of Defense military level to kind of the nation, the rhetoric politically isn't helpful. It was noted that the FERC Commission, Federal Energy Commission in Washington, voted down a proposal that had the term resilience attached to it for power plants that were nuclear or coal. Voted down unanimously. No, it didn't make sense, and that was based on a lot of good private sector utility company inputs. So I think, Bob, in summary, where it is really necessary to support the military mission and where there's that good, strong business case, things are progressing. The biggest price, I guess, if I would have put it that way, is that we had so much momentum going on in the last administration. This isn't a political comment, but just the priorities. That we're taking a little bit of a slowdown. We're running far less quickly than we were, and it's opportunity loss. We are going, because of the powerful dynamics of why it makes so much sense for every sector of our society and economy. It will get there. We'll continue. It's just that it's going to take a little bit longer than it would have otherwise.
All right, perfect. And Susan, who do you see as basically going to be, the capital investors, the financial drivers for energy storage? Is it going to be commercial and industrial clients? Is it going to be the Department of Defense? Is it going to be the state and local governments through programs? Do you have any thoughts on where that might go?
Yeah, I think you have to follow the money and who benefits from resiliency, who benefits financially from resiliency. Military is going to be at the top of the list because it's their mission, right? So it's embedded in their reason, in their economics is to have that resiliency. I think there's a lot of industrial, and then I put industrial commercial in that category as well, because of the power quality and reliability issues, especially with the fires and the weather events that we're having, that's making power quality an issue. They're willing to invest in resiliency, and so it creates the economics for the investment in microgrids. I think less so for municipal and other state and federal agencies, because that's more experimental, or it's more they want to advance. But I think what the Energy Commission is doing right now in pushing, what is the value proposition? Standardizing, creating a template that can then be replicated is probably pretty cutting edge stuff. Because I think once some good examples are out there where you've got an industrial or a military installation that shows positive economics for in installing these technologies, it will then be replicated. They become the poster children, and you'll see a lot of replication. And I think now in the wake of the disasters, the economic benefit of resiliency is starting to be tangible.
No, that's great point. Now, one thing that concerns me is the holistic cost of sustainment. If you look at, the sexiness of establishing a project, putting a battery system in place, putting renewables in place, that's fine, but there's a tail. There's a financial tail that goes with sustainment. The Navy did a lot of their own self-financed projects at the beginning and didn't have a sustainment strategy, and basically the systems didn't work through their useful life. So I would ask Dan, have you any thoughts on how we're going to keep it once we have it?
Well, I think there needs to be from either, like we work with the CBs on the project we're doing at Port Hueneme, and there needs to be a lot of direct involvement, starting with the design so they have a very clear understanding of how the system works, how it's, what it was designed to do, and that they're constantly engaged throughout the entire project. A lot of projects we see that we design it, we engineer it, we build it, it sits for 2 months, we get a phone call. No one knows what's going on or how to operate it, and that is not a sustainable business model. And I'd also highly, highly recommend a very thorough, comprehensive control system that can actually model in real time how the system is performing versus how it was designed, and that it takes out the human involvement in it, and that there's automatically updating to ensure that the solar is producing what it was supposed to, the battery is available, the demand charge management is actually providing payback as it was established. So a lot of upfront analytics on the control system will really keep an eye on the performance of the system going forward.
Now,
Can I add that before
Please
you go on?
do. Yes.
So the economic sustainability is really critical, right? Who's going to invest in a system? Only the military would invest in a system that's there when you need it, and doesn't have to earn its keep, but not everybody has that mission or that luxury. What we're seeing is the whole financial matrix of grid operations is changing, right? Where customers are participating in grid balancing either by selling services, providing services, and being remunerated for that from either the utility or from the grid operators, or and those markets are just now starting to develop. And so one of the things that we do is, focus of my company is to we have the software platform that actually helps end-use customers monetize those distributed resources in order to be able to create the economic value for them, and out of all the potential opportunities. Santa Barbara is a really good example. We're working on a project with the University of California at Santa Barbara, which is right on the edge of the grid. A reliability issue, the fires down there take out the 220 kV lines, the entire Santa Barbara area can be isolated for up to 2 weeks. And so that's a unique resiliency, reliability issue in an area where, and the campus is at the center of, it's a community resource because that's where they provide a lot of assistance during that. So they're the perfect candidate for a microgrid. For the last 10 years, they invested in their grid infrastructure, and they invested in a ton of renewable generation, none of which was designed to be a standalone microgrid or support critical facilities for over an extended outage. Right? They weren't thinking in those terms. So we're designing now a microgrid for them where they're reconstructing their renewable to be able to basically provide renewable generation for extended outage. But for the 364 days a year when there's not a grid outage, being able to utilize those distributed resources to participate in grid support at both the CAISO level and at Edison level and get paid for it. So the model works. I mean, they can generate $500,000 a year in revenue by taking their existing resources and designing them to support, to get paid for being part of grid support, and then when there's an outage, the infrastructure is in place. That has to be the future of microgrids.
No, that's a great comment. I was going to ask Chairman Weissenmiller, what future incentives or catalysts do you have up your sleeve to kind of keep the momentum going through the California Energy Commission? I mean, you've done great so far.
Well, again, part of it is a roadmap that ties things together, which certainly will have to deal with some of the PUC and ISO issues. Part of it is trying to identify the high-value places and try to get some demonstrations out. The early ones were pretty much campuses, military. We did a pretty interesting one in Northern California, which was an evacuation center. You know, and indeed they had a fire, and they were without power for several days, so that was important. But as you start thinking, well, what about hospitals? You know, what about prisons? I mean, what about campuses again, which you can't, you know, it's back to Susan's analogy. You got to be prepared if you lose power that you're going to have that reliability, but then how do you come up with ways to really support the cash flow, and how do you really use technology? I mean, obviously, we're much more of a technology-driven society than a market-driven society, but how do we get the technology to enable that combination of resilience and also standard operation at the same time?
No, that's a great point. Now, Denny, we have talked primarily about California, which is really why we're here. You want to talk a little about New London and kind of the public-private mix there, because that was extremely innovative.
We have a really, really good partnership with the state of Connecticut and with some of the utilities up in the area of New London, Connecticut, where our Navy submarine base one of our submarine bases on the Atlantic coast lies. And they are putting in a hybrid type of microgrid with some natural gas, a lot of renewable energy, and control systems along the lines that Susan described that really help you to know what is going on, the health usage monitoring type of system. In addition to that, and this is really where public-private, military, civilian partnerships are so important, the city that surrounds the New London Naval Base is going to be part of the microgrid, so that when the next superstorm, Sandy or whatever, comes along, they're going to be able to benefit from the investment that the state and the military continue to make in the Naval Submarine Base New London. These types of opportunities are really, really, I think, a model, not just in New London, but across the country, wherever there are military bases, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Army, where you can create partnerships that have synergistic benefits and can help both stakeholder communities.
Yeah, in Hawaii, the Army actually constructed a 50-megawatt multi-fuel power plant that was designed to export power outside the fence line to hospitals and other key assets, nursing homes. So I think, you know, that is true public-private. You know, you can't keep it at home yourself. We have time for maybe one more comment from our panel members. Would anyone like to bring up one final point to close on?
I will start by saying thank you, Chairman Weissenmiller, and your staff, Chief of Staff Kevin Barker, and all of the commissioners and all of the other agencies, the CPUC, CAISO, CARB, that you have brought together to work in partnership with the military in the state. And it is just an example that needs to be replicated across the country. This is the laboratory of energy's future in the state of California. The needs are great, and Dr. Weissenmiller just highlighted this unbelievably emergent need that is so acute now because of forest fires. But I think that there's so much that benefit that has come and will continue to come from these strong partnerships. And thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, and certainly part of our vision, obviously, is to use the California laboratory and then go worldwide with our country, with our companies.
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists and thank the audience, and I enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.